welcome everybody. Welcome to our members and our guests at today's special event. And a very warm welcome to our two guest speakers who will help us to explore the strategic and practical implications of the Government's Defence Surface Combatant Fleet Review. Jennifer Parker and Associate Professor Adam Lockyer, which will be followed by a panel discussion which will be moderated by our very own Captain Chris Skinner. Now, on 20 February 2024, the Government released its blueprint for a larger and more lethal surface combatant fleet for the Royal Australian Navy, which it hailed as more than doubling the size of the surface combat fleet under the former government's plan. Under this plan, Navy's future surface fleet is to comprise some 26 major surface combatants, has upgraded Hobart-class air warfare destroyers, 6 new Hunter-class frigates to boost Navy's undersea warfare and strike capabilities, and 11 new general-purpose frigates that will provide maritime and land strike air defence and escort capabilities. The increase in the size of the surface fleet has been welcomed, I believe. However, the plan also has its critics. The 6 remaining Anzac-class frigates will be decommissioned, and the make-up of the 25 minor vessels planned to contribute to civil maritime security operations will no longer include all 12 of the new Arafura-class offshore patrol vessels. Now, RUSI New South Wales Strategy Special Interest Group and many other public security analysts and think tanks, as well as the more informed journalists, have voiced some concerns. With the potential for regional conflict greater than ever, the Navy will receive no new capability before 2030. Our Strategy Special Interest Group refers to this as the 8+ year frigate gap. By 2030, the number of destroyers and frigates will probably have dropped maybe from 11 to 6, raising questions as to whether this is enough to maintain our sea lines of communication in a crisis, and in particular to safeguard the import of petroleum products necessary to allow our economy to function, exacerbated by the decision not to proceed with the planned upgrade of the Anzac frigates and the cancellation of the 6 offshore patrol vessels. Really punting, for want of a better word, on an off-the-shelf foreign-designed frigate and trusting to have some built by the end of the decade, which, based on learned experience, might be somewhat rose-coloured glass thinking. Building 4 to 8 general-purpose frigates at the same time as 6 Hunter frigates and the AUKUS submarine is also likely to challenge defence's capabilities to manage professionally and maybe beyond the capacity of Australian industry to service, and beyond the capacity for Navy to man or to person the fleet, given Navy's current undermanning and ongoing recruiting and retention issues. And as our recent Strategy Special Interest Group report observed, Australia's new Hunter-class anti-submarine warfare frigate currently under development is based on the British Type 26 frigate, the development of which has proved highly problematic. And, as is our wont, of course, we have made things more complicated by modifying the design to meet our own special needs. Now, admittedly, Britain's first Sea Lord was in Australia only recently, and he advised that the Type 26 is now on track to enter service towards the end of the decade and would be world leading. We can only hope that we shall be so lucky with the new 6 Hunters that we plan to build at an estimated cost of $45 billion. So challenges indeed. And we are very much looking forward to today's presentations and discussion as we explore some of these issues. Jennifer Parker, who is well qualified to speak on these matters, will be our first speaker. Jennifer is an expert associate at the National Security College, Australian National University, an Adjunct Fellow in Naval Studies at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, and Jennifer also holds the position of Nancy Bentley Associate Fellow in Indo-Pacific Maritime Affairs at the Council of Geostrategy. Jennifer will be well known to many in this room. She is a much respected and highly sought after commentator who produces the weekly Maritime Matters podcast and the Australian Naval Institute's Saltwater Strategists podcast, which focused on the Indo-Pacific Maritime Affairs and is regularly featured in Australian and international print, digital, radio and TV media. Maybe less known is Jennifer's military service, having served for more than 20 years with the Royal Australian Navy. During her time in the Navy, Jennifer specialised as a principal warfare officer, including undertaking deep specialist training with the Royal Navy in anti-submarine warfare. Jennifer has operational experience with the Middle East, from the Middle East to the Caribbean, and has undertaken a series of naval appointments nationally and internationally in areas including force design, strategy, career management, international exercise planning and operations. And that included service as an exchange officer with the Royal Navy and as a second in command of HMAS Darwin, one of the Royal Australian Navy's guided missile frigates. Her last appointment was as Director of Operations in Bahrain of the Combined Maritime Forces, a 38-nation coalition promoting national security in the Middle East and Indian Ocean region. Maybe even lesser known, found out Jennifer is also a lawyer, so in good stead, and was admitted into the ACT Supreme Court. Jennifer, we are greatly honoured to have you with us today, so could you please join me and welcome Jennifer to the podium.
Kim, thank you so much. It's always very awkward when people read out your bio. It sounds much more impressive than it actually is. I find it funny these days. I actually left the Royal Australian Navy only last year. I always find it interesting how people define me, whether it's as an academic or as a lawyer, as a naval officer, or some people say commentator, which apparently is offensive if you're an academic. I'm not really across all of those terms. But look, thank you so much to Kim, to Ron, to RUSI New South Wales for having me here to talk about the future of the Royal Australian Navy's surface combatant fleet. It is a really important topic, and perhaps because we haven't spoken about it so much or enough in the last 20 years, is how we find ourselves in this position. And when I say in this position, what do I mean? Well, I have a lot of respect for the 16,000 women and men who serve in the Royal Australian Navy. They spend a lot of time away from their family and friends, and unfortunately, given the geopolitical circumstances, they will likely be called on to do some pretty difficult things in the next 10 years. But the problem is, despite the hard work and professionalism of those 16,000 people, we have the smallest Navy. Now, you can cut it different ways and play with statistics if you want to be optimistic, but to be honest, the smallest Navy, certainly the smallest number of surface combatants that we have had since the early 1950s. And we have that in a time frame where we say that there is no strategic warning time, and that we are facing the most challenging geopolitical circumstances, some say since World War II, some say in the last 50 years. Either way, it's a pretty challenging time. So that's a really difficult period for an island nation that is dependent on trade, and 98% of our trade comes to the maritime domain to find itself in. So what I'm going to talk through today is just a little bit for those that think that we should have gotten tanks as opposed to more tanks as opposed to more ships. Why do we need a navy? Why does it matter to Australia? Now, you think that would be quite obvious for Australia, but historically it actually hasn't been. So I'm going to talk through that. I'll talk through how the Navy is expanding. It is expanding in terms of its number of surface combatants, but it's expanding in a number of other ways as well, which means that in many ways it is going through some of its most significant change since World War II, or certainly in recent time. And that in itself takes up a lot of bandwidth for the Navy. I'll talk about how we got here, how did we get to the point where I would say we have the smallest number of surface combatants and the least powerful Navy that we have had for a very long time. I'll talk about some of the outcomes of the Surface Combatant Fleet Review, which is broadly, in my view, good news, but we do have a time and space problem now. I'll then talk through some of the criticisms of the review, some of the wider strategy considerations. I find it unfortunate that you can't pull out a document that says Australia's maritime strategy. I think that's unfortunate for an island nation. Now, many would say that, well, many countries don't have maritime strategies. UK does. The US does. India does. I'm actually helping Fiji write their maritime strategy. So I think it's something that Australia should look at. And perhaps if we had done this, and interestingly, 20 years ago, almost to the day, we had a joint standing committee on foreign affairs and defence and trade that looked at Australia's maritime strategy. One of its recommendations was that Australia has a maritime strategy. Anyway, so I'll get into that. Before I do though, this picture here, it's a really cool picture. Unfortunate though for the Russian ship, that is the Deterrence, which is a Russian corvette, that was sunk by uncrewed surface vessels in Ukraine, uncrewed surface vessels in the Black Sea. One of the things I will talk about is this whole idea that we don't need surface combatants because we've got USVs. If I don't get into that enough, then please ask me questions on it. It's a bit of a furphy. Okay, why do we need a Navy? Well, not to go back to the historical strategists, because that would be quite a boring conversation. I do really like this quote from Alfred de Maha. Now, he was an American naval strategist. Some people think he was amazing. Some people think he was a bit full of crap. But either way, he's often quoted, and I think this is a really good quote. Wars are won by the economic strangulation of the enemy from the sea. Now, that's not always the case for continental powers, but certainly is the case for island nations, of which Australia is. And when you think about some of these statistics, whether it be the fact that we have a coastline of just under 60,000 kilometres, the fact that 98% of our trade travels through the maritime domain, the fact that in terms of our fuel, so the way that we have shut down almost all of our fuel refineries means that 91% of our fuel is imported. Now, a lot of people would say, oh yes, that comes from Southeast Asia. We know that we need to protect our maritime trade in Southeast Asia. But in an unrefined state, because the crude oil doesn't come from Southeast Asia, it actually comes all the way across the Western Indian Ocean. That's quite a big maritime problem if you want to think about protecting our fuel supply. Some strategists have recently come out, so Professor Hugh White, a very well-known Australian strategist, came out and said, well, what we can do, don't worry about the surface fleet, just create a bubble around Australia and defend that. Well, I don't know where the fuel for the F-35s is going to come from, because it's certainly not coming from Australia. So we do have a bit of a challenge. The other point that I think we really need to be grappling with is this concept that 99% of Australia's internet travels through undersea data cables, which are easily cut in the event of a conflict. And we have seen in the last couple of years, whether it be cables in the Taiwan Strait that have been accidentally or intentionally cut, depending on how you look at it, or pipelines in Europe, so the Nord Stream pipeline, this is becoming an increasing problem. That will be a problem for Australia. So for all of those reasons, Navy really matters to Australia. So I guess I want to talk through what are the current capabilities of the fleet before we talk about how it's expanding. Well, the backbone of the fleet is the concept of the surface combatants. So the surface combatants are the offensive and defensive ships within the Royal Australian Navy, the ones that have the missiles, the torpedoes, the ones that predominantly engage in naval warfare. We currently have 10 of those. Now, when you think about maintenance of a ship, and if you're an engineer in this room, specifically a naval engineer, you're going to get very upset at my comment, but if you're not a naval engineer, this makes sense. You go on about a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you have 9 ships, you can expect to have 3 operational at any time, 3 in training, and 3 in maintenance. So if you have 10 surface combatants, that means that at any time, unless we kind of need to surge for something, which has follow-on effects in terms of maintenance sustainment, we have about 3.3 ships available for deployment. That is a problem. That is a big problem when you talk about the fact that we are facing some of the biggest strategic circumstances we have faced in a very long time. Now, we also have replenishment vessels, because if you want to have endurance, you want to be able to get across those lengthy sea lines of communication, or even around our extensive exclusive economic zone, which is the 3rd largest in the world, then you need to be able to replenish the ships. And it's a huge constraint for a surface combatant to need to go into port to replenish. So that's why we have tankers. So the Royal Australian Navy currently has 2 tankers, HMAS Supply and HMAS Stalwart, that can replenish food, some ammunition, not missiles. Ask me a question about that in the question time, because this is a bit of a controversial topic, and fuel. Problem with 2, well, if we go back to that 3-to-1 ratio, that means that we more than likely don't have 1 operational for every single day of the year. That's a problem. What is currently a bigger problem, although I'm sure we'll work through it, is neither of them are currently operational because of defects. One of them, in the last estimates, it was said won't sail till next year, and the other one, it's unclear but clearly needs maintenance. We also have a bunch of amphibious ships. So we have our two LHDs, so the Adelaide and the Canberra class, our flagships. We have HMAS Choules, which has become kind of the workhorse of the Navy, and you might remember the images from January 2020 of Choules evacuating the citizens of Malakuta from the beach. We have a bunch of patrol vessels, which I won't delve into too much, except to highlight that the Navy provides a lot of the horsepower for Maritime Border Command because because Australia does not have a Coast Guard. Now, some people say, we kind of have a Coast Guard. You've got Australian Border Force. Australian Border Force, in terms of its maritime element, is very small. Don't quote me exactly on the figures, but say it's about 350 people and not many vessels. So actually it's mostly picked up by the Australian Navy Patrol Force, and often when we don't have enough of those patrol vessels at sea, we send billion-dollar warships to go and look for illegal fishers and irregular migrants. So there's a bit of a structural problem now. I'll talk to that a little bit later. What else do we have? Well, you may have heard, if you've watched the news in the last couple of years, we have submarines. We have 6 of them, the Collins-class submarines. They are ageing, and they are reaching their life of type, which is the amount of expected time we expected them to serve. There is a plan to replace this, of course, which is AUKUS, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a couple of future slides, but I won't go into too much depth. So if you want to go into the depth of AUKUS, then please, we can do that with questions. There is lots to talk about. We have mine hunters, but not for much longer. So unfortunately, in the recent National Defence Strategy that was released in May this year, and the associated Integrated Investment Program, which is the capability element of the defence bucket, one of the trade-offs for all the new capability we're accelerating is we won't be replacing our mine hunters. Now, there was a view that we could fill that capability with autonomous vessels, which certainly has some merits, especially in things like port clearance, but there are some challenges in terms of expeditionary operations, because you do need a vessel to deploy them from. We are almost at the point where we can say we used to have survey ships, so survey ships responsible for charting, pretty important function for expeditionary operations, pretty important function for amphibious operations, important for being able to operate our submarines, and incredibly important if you want to do things, for example, like humanitarian disaster relief after the result of an earthquake in the Pacific, because when you have those things happen, obviously the seabed changes and you need to survey it. We used to have 6. We have 1 left. We had HMAS Mel decommissioned about 2 weeks ago, I think. And now we have HMAS Lewin. Now, in 2020, the government made a decision that we would outsource most of our surveying to the hydro scheme, so we'd have civilian ships doing it, which for most of the Australian charting responsibilities, that makes sense. But for expeditionary naval operations, that's going to be a problem in the future. The reason I go through that is to highlight the fact that not everything in the Navy is about the submarines and the surface combatants. And we've had recent significant reviews that have looked at surface combatants and have looked at submarines, but we haven't had something that has looked at the wider structure of what are the capabilities the Navy needs to deliver. And so a lot of those enabling capabilities, I think at the moment, are suffering. There's no plan for them because there is such focus and investment in surface combatants and submarines. So, surface combatant fleet, where are we? So it's interesting. In 1986, Paul Dibb did a pretty influential review, and he looked at the 3 arms of the Australian Defence Force and the standard structure. It was 100 fighter jets, 12 surface combatants, and I can't remember what it was for Army, so I apologise for the Army people in this room. Anyway, the key point was, he said, the Australian Defence Force has always been obsessed with this is what they need, but there is absolutely no strategic justification behind this. So he went into the 87 white paper and he said, from the Navy, we need to expand the surface combatant fleet. 12 surface combatants, which means about 4 operational at any time, is not enough for a country with the 3rd largest exclusive economic zone in the world. Let alone the idea of a conflict in the region or anything like that. It's just simply not enough. Unfortunately, though, that was never resourced. So not only did we not have 12 at the beginning of this year, we actually only had 11. Now, of those 11, and I say at the beginning of this year because we decommissioned one in May this year, so we now have 10. Of those 11, they're under a whole lot of pressure. Now, the 2009 white paper actually looked at the surface combatant fleet and it said, we need to make a decision to replace the surface combatant fleet. It didn't say expand it, but it said, hey, the Anzacs are starting to age. So the first Anzac was commissioned in the 90s. It was as a result of the 87 white paper. We need to make a plan to replace these. The problem was no decision was made by government until 2018. So 9 years was lost in the decision making. 2018, the decision was made to acquire the Hunter class, which I'll talk a little bit more about. It is going to be a great ship. It's incredibly expensive. It's undefendable. But anyway, the decision was made in 2018, and we might get our first Hunter class in 2034, which is 25 years from the white paper that said you needed to replace the Anzacs to the actual Hunter class first being in the water. Now, what that means is that the Anzac class are ageing. Now, a 2019 ANAO audit report actually looked at the sustainment of the Anzacs. And not only did it say they're ageing, because that's obvious, just do some maths, it said that they've been used at a much higher operational rate than they were ever planned for, which makes sense, right? Because if you have a review that says we need 20 ships, we have 11 ships, of course you're going to be using them more than they were designed for. And therefore, in 2019, there are a lot of concerns about the hulls and the sustainability. Not to mention that we sent Anzac classes down to the Southern Ocean, which they are not built for because we have no capability to operate there to chase illegal fishers. And so I think some of these quotes are quite kind of instructive and kind of tell us where we are. So in 2019, the ANAO audit said Defence has been aware since at least 2012 that sustaining arrangements have not kept pace with the higher expected operational usage. Defence has advised the government to extend the Anzac class life of type to 2043 was not based on a transition plan or informed by analysis of the frigate's physical capacity to deliver the required capability until then. So when the decision was finally made on the Hunter class in 2018, the plan was to let the Anzac class limp over the line, extend every single hull by 9 years so we would have enough frigates when the Hunters came into service. But concerningly, the ANAO audit report says that that was not actually based on any analysis that the ships would last that long. And it said that the Anzac class had experienced degradation of the ship's hulls and subsystems with successive reviews and performance information highlighting the link between a lack of conformance to operating intent, reduced platform life and reduced sustainment efficiency. So in 2019 we had an audit that told us these ships are not going to last as long as you had hoped they were, and that's before you decide to extend them 9 years. So we always knew sustaining the Anzacs was going to be a problem. Other pressures on the surface combatants. So currently we have 7 Anzac class ships, so they are the majority of our surface combatants, but not all. We also have 3 Hobart class ships, which are much newer and much more capable. But there are other pressures on them. So one of the biggest challenges for Australian defence is how do we deal with ballistic missile defence, right? We've certainly seen in the war in Ukraine, we have certainly seen in the Middle East, whether it is the Houthis using ballistic missiles against ships in the Red Sea, whether it is Iran firing ballistic missiles into Israel, ballistic missiles are increasingly proliferated. And they are very difficult to defend against because of the trajectory that they take. So for ships to be able to defend against the ballistic missiles, they need to have certain weapons and certain combat systems. So we realised that our Hobart class destroyers needed to go through an upgrade to be able to deal with ballistic missiles. So that's the Aegis, which is the combat system on the Hobart class, baseline 9 upgrade. The problem with this is that as much as we say we have 10 ships, 3-to-1 ratio, you've got 3.3 operational end time, actually that ratio is going to be less because we need to go through a series of upgrades. So the Hobart class from 2026 will be out for a fair bit of time as they go through this upgrade. We're also hoping to put new missiles into them, so the Tomahawk missile, which will extend the time of the upgrade. We are also integrating the Naval Strike Missile, which is a surface-to-surface missile, replacing the Harpoon anti-surface missile, into the ships as well. And HMAS Sydney actually recently fired one at RIMPAC, some really good footage if you want to look it up online. Not only do we have issues with sustainment of the Anzacs, the age of the Anzacs, not only are we trying to upgrade elements of the weapon systems on the Anzacs and upgrade our Hobart destroyers, on top of all of that, and again, we only have 10, half as many as any review said that we needed, and this is before the issues of strategic warning time, we also, because we don't have a Coast Guard, use a lot of our Navy surface combatants to supplement Operation Sovereign Borders, right, which is the looking for irregular migrants, Maritime Border Command things. Now, that doesn't make the press very much because Operation Sovereign Borders doesn't make the press because we don't talk about it unless something gets through. But what you can see is there is a lot of stress on the current fleet. And I haven't even mentioned the issues in the Red Sea, I haven't even mentioned the issues in the South China Sea, the defence relationships we're trying to grow through exercises with Indonesia, with the Philippines, etc. So it's under a lot of stress. So then we get to the point where, okay, this has kind of been acknowledged, right, by the current government, and the Navy is expanding. It's expanding in a couple of ways. So this talk is mainly about the Surface Combatant Fleet Review, so I'll talk about that, but also is expanding in terms of its workforce. So we all know from the papers that Navy has workforce problems, and in fact the Defence Strategic Review said one of its biggest concerns for the Navy was workforce problems. In 2022, the decision was made to expand the entire Department of Defence. The government then, at the time, in March 22, announced that it was a 30% expansion of the Department of Defence between 2024 and 2040. It is actually a 20% expansion. I can genuinely say that because I drafted the talking points that went to the minister and they came back and they said 30%. And I said, but you can just do the maths. It's not 30%, it's 20%. But anyway, it's politics for you. But it is expanding. Now, as part of the expansion of the Department of Defence, the Navy is due to expand from its current size, which is about 16,000. It was about 15,000 at the time of that announcement, to 20,000 by 2040, which is pretty significant for the Navy. Now, a lot of people say the Navy just doesn't have enough people. It's easy to say that. When you actually look at the history of the Royal Australian Navy's workforce strength, there's only been a few times in our history that the Navy has actually had more personnel than it does now. So at the beginning of World War II, the Navy had just under 6,000 people. At the end of World War II, it had 39,000 people. So yep, absolutely, major conflict, the Navy was a lot bigger. Outside of World War II, the only time the Navy, in terms of personnel numbers, clearly not in terms of ship numbers, in terms of personnel numbers, has been bigger than it is right now, is between a period of 1976 and 1985. And it reached the height of 17,500. So when we talk about the fact that we have workforce pressures, which is true, right, it's actually not about the number of people in uniform, which is my view. It's actually about structure and how we use those people. Now, that is much easier to say on the outside than to fix on the inside. And I was previously the Chief of Staff of Navy Career Management, so I can genuinely say that. But I think it is a problem in terms of the fact that when we think about the Navy and we accept that we only have 10 surface combatants and some of them can't go to sea because they can't be crewed, we say, we get it, we know the Navy has workforce problems. But I would say that the problems are actually partly structural. The other way that, and now this is probably a little bit cheeky, right, in terms of Navy expansion, because I put Army there and taking credit for it in terms of Navy expansion, but the Army Littoral Combat Craft is also expanding significantly. So not only are we trying to build up the Navy's fleet, build up the AUKUS submarine program, we're actually giving the Army the most amount of ships it has had since World War II. So in World War II, the Army, not at the beginning, but at the end, had a significant number of craft from all different areas. Outside of that, the Army has operated some craft, not a lot. At times, for example, the old, we call them LCHs, your Balikapapans, those things. The Army were initially meant to operate them, but they gave them to the Navy because of workforce problems. So the Army is also going to be getting 18 landing craft medium, which are about the size of a patrol boat, right? So about 500, 600 tonnes, and 8 landing craft heavy. And so Pat Conroy announced in WA about a month ago that we're going to accelerate that. They're going to come very quickly. We'll get the first landing craft heavy before we do then their first new frigate. Those landing craft heavy are anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 tonnes, which is big for a ship. So an Anzac class, so our main surface combatant, is about 3,500 tonnes, maybe closer to 4 given some of the upgrades. These landing craft heavy will actually be bigger than the Anzac class. So if you think of HMAS Tobruk, kind of like 8 of the HMAS Tobruks, which is a good ship, by the way. I had my 18th birthday on HMAS Tobruk. Good ship. It was a very dry 18th birthday. But so the Army is also expanding, right, in terms of its Navy capability. And those things need to be protected. So this is a problem for the Navy. So I mentioned all the ways the Navy is expanding, the expansion of the surface combatant fleet, the expansion of the workforce, the AUKUS expansion, the Army expansion, which will have huge impacts on Navy. But interestingly, there hasn't been any structural review. And I do think that is a challenge. I've got a paper coming out with the National Security College in October talking about the conversation around a Coast Guard. Do we need to revisit a Coast Guard? Now, most people yawn and we're like, we did this in the early 2000s, Kim Beazley pushed it didn't get up, let's move on. But one of the problems with the obligations on the Navy is that they do a lot in terms of maritime border protection. Now, people think that they don't because we have Australian Border Force and Maritime Border Command, but actually they provide a whole lot of support for that. But if we're really talking about the fact that we have no strategic warning time, that we are an island nation and a conflict, if God forbid we're involved in one in the Indo-Pacific, would be a maritime conflict, then the Navy's not going to be in a position to be protecting our offshore oil platforms or dealing with the increased rates of irregular migration or protecting our ports, because the small Navy is going to be off fighting that battle. So I think we need to be thinking about structure. Some of the other challenges, so I mentioned that we have 2 replenishment ships that support the Royal Australian Navy. They have a crew of about 190 each. Now, your average tanker that sails the oceans probably has a crew of about 20, right? Of course, when you're replenishing at sea, you're going to have more people to support RAS rigs, but 190. I do think we need to think about things like, do we need a Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which the UK has? Now, they have all sorts of problems right now with strikes, so that's not the great example. But we also had during World War II, do we need to think of ways to get replenishment ships into the order of battle for the Royal Australian Navy that aren't crewed by naval officers and sailors, that have a reduced crewing but can support replenishing the fleet? And I think there are ways to do that that don't involve very expensive ships with 190 crew on it. Okay, so now we get to the actual point of this talk, which is the expansion of the surface combatant fleet. So I talked a little bit about how we got here. This is a bit of self-promotion, I guess. This is a report that I released last year called an Australian Maritime Strategy Resourcing the Royal Australian Navy. I put it up because I actually, I never took credit for it, but Senator David Van said to me recently, he's like, did you realise that when you released this report, which I think was about October last year, you almost exactly predicted what came out in the Surface Combatant Fleet Review in February this year? And you said, did you know? Like, you know, did someone give you a heads up? Stu Mayer, who's on the review team, is my old CO, did he tell you? The answer was no, and I don't take any particular credit except for the fact that the answer was pretty obvious, because after 50 years of reviews telling us how many ships we needed, that was pretty obvious. The Hunter-class frigate program, which was meant to be 9 ships, that was not going to start delivering until the mid-30s. It was obvious from the ANAO audit report the Anzac class weren't going to last that long. It was also obvious they were becoming too expensive to build 9, and so obvious that the ANAO actually said that. So as much as I'd love to take credit for the fact that I predicted the outcomes of the Surface Combatant Fleet Review, to be honest, it was just obvious to anyone who sat down and put their mind to it. So, I kind of talked about how we got here, so I'll move on. Oh, actually, I'm going to go back. Right. So I talked about the fact that Dibb said in 1986 he can't understand why we think that we always need 12 surface combatants. We very clearly need more. The 2009 white paper said that we need to replace the Anzac class, but we didn't make the decision until 2018. 9 years that were lost there. Could have had a few frigates in that time frame. 2020, we said, okay, the world has changed and we no longer have 10 years strategic warning time. Now that was pretty significant. Sometimes it's misquoted. When we talk about strategic warning time, really it is a force design construct more than anything else. It doesn't actually mean that we're about to end up in a conflict. It means that previously we designed the Australian Defence Force on the idea that we would have 10 years warning to get the capabilities we needed for a conflict in the region. And so the removal of 10 years strategic warning time partially was because of the rise of China in terms of their military capabilities with limited transparency, their increased aggression in the South China Sea. By 2020, we'd seen China go through the island reclamation in the Spratly Islands and militarise a significant number of those islands. But also part of it was because the rest of the region was also very much catching up to our capability. So where historically from a naval standpoint we had a bit of a capability overmatch with a lot of the countries in the region, by 2020 that really wasn't the case. So we said no such thing as strategic warning time, there is a potential for conflict. But we didn't make any decisions about enhancing the capability of the Royal Australian Navy, except that we would acquire mines, which is great, we do need offensive mining. But we didn't address this whole issue that we had 11 service combatants, we planned to have 12, but we knew that wasn't going to be enough. Then we get to the Defence Strategic Review. Now by 2023 there's a lot of criticism of the Hunter-class frigate program. Its costs were blowing out, so originally they were meant to be about $35 billion, outturned. They then jumped to $45 billion. This year they were quoted as $65 billion. That probably was a little bit convenient, to be honest. It probably wasn't quite true. But either way, we know there's problems with that. So the Defence Strategic Review, which was done in 8 months, the team did a great job in 8 months. But where I have some challenges with it is it didn't have a holistic look at what are the capabilities that we need to support our maritime operations and what are the maritime tasks that we need to deliver. In fact, if you read the, and again, no criticism of them, a good friend of mine is one of the key authors of this, but if you read the Navy section of it, all it really says is, geez, we need to review the service combatants, there's a problem there. Okay, that's pretty obvious, but yep. We need to support AUKUS. Okay, that's pretty obvious, we announced that in 2021, and Navy has a workforce problem. It doesn't talk about amphibious capabilities, except for Army amphibious capability. It doesn't talk about mine warfare, it doesn't talk about hydrography, it doesn't talk about clearance diver functions, it doesn't talk about the whole functions that a Navy needs. So then out of this Defence Strategic Review comes a review which is this Surface Combatant Fleet Review, but one of the problems is it only looks at surface combatants. So as we went through at the beginning of this talk, the Navy does a whole bunch of other functions than just surface combatants, right? But it only looked at surface combatants. So then, skip over that. So then we get to the point of February this year. So the Defence Strategic Review dropped in April last year. Unfortunately, when it came to Navy, it just recommended another review. There were some reasons behind that. So there was another review conducted, and the decision wasn't made until February this year. So if you think about 8 months for the DSR to be drafted, there's another 11 months until we get the outcome of Surface Combatant Fleet Review. There's 19 months where we knew we had a big problem, where we've been mulling it over and thinking about it. And again, as I said, when people talked about how accurate this document was, not because I was particularly intelligent when it came to maritime strategy, I like to think I am, but not because I particularly was, it's because the answer was obvious. So we wasted 19 months to come up with an obvious answer, which is that we need to expand the surface combatant fleet. So again, I guess what I'm trying to talk through is how we got here, and not to be critical. It's easy to stand on the outside and be critical. It's much harder to actually address these things, and that is acknowledged. But we have wasted a significant amount of time from the 2009 white paper that said the Anzacs are ageing, from 2014 when China started militarising islands in the Spratlys, from 2020 when we removed the concept of strategic warning time, to get to 2024 where we say we've got to expand the surface combatant fleet to 20. Now government says 26, I'll tell you in a second why I don't believe the 26 comment, but to 20, which is actually what Paul Dibb said in 1987, right? So again, we have found ourselves in this circumstance, and part of my thinking on it, when I get to strategy I'll talk about it, is because I don't think we have a clear maritime strategy. I'm not sure that we understand as an island nation what we want to achieve. what are the functions we need to deliver, and so therefore we keep having these piecemeal look at issues. So we looked at the submarine issue through AUKUS, right? Okay, I think that was a pretty good outcome. Some people would disagree. We looked at the surface combatant issue, finally. Since 2009, we finally solved it. But we keep doing it in piecemeal ways. So we haven't looked at the issues that we have with mining warfare capability. We haven't looked at the issues that we have with hydrographic capability. We haven't looked at the issues with amphibious capability. And I do think that if we had a holistic maritime strategy, we'd have more of an understanding of why we need a coast guard, why we might need an auxiliary, why we might need a bunch of those capabilities. But anyway, so what came out in February this year? Well, the good news was that the current government said that they would invest more into shipbuilding and they would expand the Royal Australian Navy surface combatants. And sometimes that's underplayed, but that actually is pretty historic because every review of the surface combatant fleet structure for the last 50 years has said that the Royal Australian Navy needed more surface combatants. But no government in the last 50 years was willing to resource that. Right? And Beasley's spoken about this a fair bit in terms of once we got to the 90s, he just couldn't get the money to follow through with the plan that he wanted in 1987. So it is significant that the government agreed to do that. So what did they say? Well, the first thing they said is we're going to maintain 3 Hobart-class destroyers. There was a lot of discussion about should we just build more Hobart-class destroyers. They have been quite a successful capability for the Royal Australian Navy, but there are problems in terms of we shut down that production line, so our policy was continuous shipbuilding, but we didn't keep building ships. And there are also problems with some of their equipment is obsolete and it would be hard to replicate this capability. So we weren't going to expand it. The Hunter-class frigates that were determined in 2018, there was going to be 9 of those, which would have expanded the fleet by 1. In the 2040s, we're going to be reduced to 6. Now, I think this was a really good decision. Hunter-class frigates, some people have called it a lemon. It's not a lemon. It'll actually be a really good frigate when it is delivered. Often in Australia, we forget about how important anti-submarine warfare is. Now, 75% of the world's submarines operate in the Indo-Pacific, and a lot of people, if there's some retired naval officers here, you'll say, yes, but ships don't hunt submarines. Well, ships with low-frequency active towed arrays that can detect submarines at 50 nautical miles on a good day can hunt submarines, right? So this is a good capability, but the cost of it was significant because of a lot of the changes that we chose to apply to it, including the integration of the CEA radar, which is a great, fantastic designed Australian radar, but also the integration of the US combat system and a bunch of other things. So at the time of the announcement of the expansion of surface combatant fleet review in February this year, they said that this was priced at $65 billion for 9 frigates. Now, conveniently, the previous year they said it was $45 billion, so whether those figures are accurate, i.e. potentially they just said it was $65 billion so they could justify cancelling the project, who knows, but either way, expensive. The other problem with the Hunter-class frigates is when it comes to anti-air warfare, they don't have enough missiles on them. They are general purpose frigates, but they are orientated towards anti-submarine warfare, which means they simply didn't have enough. So they had 32 vertical launch cells, so they will have 32 vertical launch cells, but this is a 10,000 tonne frigate. An Arleigh Burke destroyer, which is a US destroyer, it has 96 cells, right? So not enough, we weren't getting enough missiles to see. So when they reduced the Hunter-class frigate from 9 to 6, they also made the decision to really expand the fleet through the acquisition of the general purpose frigate. So we're going to get 11 of those, and I'll go into a bit more depth in a sec. That adds up to 20. So you've got 3 Hobart class, you've got 6 Hunters, you've got 11 general purpose frigates. 20. Well, that's what Paul Gibbs said in 1987. He said that before we had the idea of no strategic warning time, and he said that before we were expanding the Army amphibious fleet, which will also need protection. So I think it's probably not enough. But the government have kind of hedged their bets, and they've actually said we're expanding to 26 surface combatants because they're counting 6 large optionally crewed surface vessels. What is a large optionally crewed surface vessel? Well, the US has a program of large uncrewed surface vessels, of which they intend to have the first one in the water by 2026. They're going to be between 1,000 and 2,000 tonnes, so kind of half the size of an Anzac, and have between 16 and 32 missile silos on them. The way we explained it is we intend to team them with our destroyers and our frigates to increase the magazine depth at sea, which is a good thing, right? Using uncrewed capabilities, that certainly is the future of some functions of the Navy. Why do we call them optionally crewed as opposed to uncrewed? Who knows? The US said their first two will be optionally crewed. By the time we're getting these in the mid-30s, they will be an uncrewed capability. The only reason the US said their first two will be optionally crewed is because they need to have people on them to do the R&D. When you design an uncrewed capability, a lot of the space and weight is taken up. When you design a ship, a lot of the space and weight is taken up by designing the quality of life things. So, your toilets, your sculleries, all of those kind of things, your air conditioning, etc. When you design uncrewed capability, you can keep that space for firepower. So it is unlikely by the time that we are operating these in the mid to late 30s that they will actually be optionally crewed, because they won't be designed with the quality of life stuff for personnel to be on board more than just doing maintenance. So they'll probably be crewed. I think we probably call them optionally crewed because there are a number of international law issues with uncrewed surface vessels, especially when you get into the area of lethal autonomous weapons. I won't talk through that here, but happy to answer that in the questions. What else came out of it? Well, we were meant to get 12 Arafura offshore patrol vessels, which are currently being built in Adelaide. The government decided to reduce this to 6. I'll go into a bit more detail about that on a subsequent slide. The other point which is really important to highlight, so I said at the beginning of the year we had 11 Anzac class frigates, we now have 10, we decommissioned one in May. It said that whilst we needed to expand the surface combatant fleet, and we intended to, we were actually going to reduce it in the near term. So yes, it's getting bigger in the 30s, but in the 20s it is getting smaller. So HMAS Anzac has decommissioned. HMAS Arunta, one of the other Anzac classes, will decommission in 2026, and we will have 9 surface combatants until the first one arrives, hopefully in 2029. There's some other recommendations. One, we're going to produce a naval shipbuilding plan annually. That's great because we're going to be building a lot of ships apparently. We also talked a little bit about border force and sustainment and said that to look after our borders we need about 25 minor war vessels. I feel like that was just convenient, not to disrespect the team that put a lot of work into this, but convenient maths because 25 is our current plan for the Volcade class, plus the ABF vessels, plus the OPVs. So it really wasn't a change in numbers whatsoever. And interestingly, we did kind of follow on with this continuous shipbuilding. So Australia has often had a policy of continuous shipbuilding, but it hasn't actually done continuous shipbuilding. So one of the good things in this announcement in February is that we would also start planning for the replacement of the Hobart class destroyers. So we don't find ourselves in the place we find ourselves now in terms of the replacement of the Anzacs. And the replacement of the Hobart class destroyer will be built in Adelaide. So when Adelaide finishes building the Hunter class, they will move on to the replacement of the Hobart. So we might actually get a continuous shipbuilding for them. So look, in terms of those outcomes, I think it was good news, right? I think it was good news that the current government finally decided to expand the Royal Australian Navy after a lot of analysis of years saying we needed to do this and to resource it, right? Which in the current kind of cost of living crisis, if you want to call it that, was not an easy decision to make. But in some ways, it is a little bit too late. So just delving a little bit more into some of those things, probably two of the biggest outcomes. The General Purpose Frigate. So the General Purpose Frigate was the big surprise of the announcement. 11 of those. 3 of those to be built overseas in one of 4 countries, so either Spain, Germany, Japan or Korea. And 8 of those to be built in Australia, in Western Australia, and most likely by Austal. Now that hasn't been decided, but last year the government and Austal signed a strategic shipbuilding agreement, so it probably makes sense that it will be Austal. Austal have built a lot of ships, they've never built a frigate. So what else do we know about this? Well, we know that the first one is meant to come in 2029. So as much as I said the surface combatant fleet is reducing at the moment, and we'll get to 9 ships in 2026, in 2029 we should get the first replacement, which will be one of these general purpose frigates built in one of those 4 countries. One of the biggest issues with this is that one of the criticisms of the Hunter and one of the criticisms of the Arafura offshore patrol vessel program is that Defence continued to insist on too many changes. Now, it's probably partially true, but if you listen to industry, they'll say one thing, you listen to defence, they'll say one thing, the answer's probably in the middle, right? So this got a view and a lot of kind of commentators talking about the reason the offshore patrol vessel has problems is defence insisted on too many changes. The reason the Hunter class is too big and too expensive is because defence insisted on too many changes. So the government has said that there will be no changes to the general purpose frigate. It is an off-the-shelf buy. That kind of sounds good in principle, except for the fact that, of course, you need to meet Australian safety standards, right? So you're going to have to make those changes because none of those countries comply exactly with Australian safety standards. But two, when you think about things like commonality of missiles, you're not going to introduce a new missile inventory into the Royal Australian Navy, right? We use US missiles, except for the Naval Strike Missile, which is Norwegian. The US also uses that. You're not going to suddenly start using a South Korean design missile or a Japanese design missile just because that is where you're getting it from. So you're going to have to make some changes. One of the issues with this whole no changes rhetoric, though, is it does appear it's not just rhetoric. It does appear that this is government direction. In the last set of estimates, there were some interesting exchanges between Linda Reynolds and the head of Navy capability. And the head of Navy capability, so the admiral in charge of this, very experienced guy who spent a lot of time in Navy capability, said, I need to go to the Defence Committee before I can make a change to that vessel other than the language that the instructions are written in. Now that's concerning because I think that shows that the government has lost some trust in defence and in Navy through the Hunter class and the OPV. Now, maybe that might be fair, right? Maybe it's not fair. You'd have to be the people in the room when that happened to understand where some of those responsibilities lie, probably on both sides. But I think when we go back to my point about naval structure and Defence Force structure more broadly, we have more senior officers in the Defence Force than we have ever had. In fact, the Navy has 18 admirals, so it could put an admiral in command of every single one of its service combatants and still have 8 left over to command the Navy, which is more than it had during World War II. The Army and the Air Force are nearly as bad. The problem with continuing to push up decision-making within defence is meaning that defence, whilst it's meant to be becoming more agile and more responsive, it's becoming less agile and less responsive. So, a lot of people would say, yes, good, fantastic that the government is telling them they can't make any changes and it needs to go through this high-level decision-making, but I think it's concerning we get to the point where we're not trusting admirals to make these decisions. Now, I'm not saying it's what the government has said, but I think you can interpret a little bit from that. Okay, offshore patrol vessel. So the offshore patrol vessel, originally it came up in the 2009 white paper again. That was a pretty good white paper for Navy. It talked about replacing the Hunters, talked about the 12 submarines that became the ill-fated attack submarine program, which we won't talk about. Ruined our relationship with French for a little while. And it talked about getting an offshore combat vessel. Now, initially this was meant to supplement some of the littoral warfighting capability of the surface combatant fleet. Over subsequent iterations of the design, it then became the offshore patrol vessel. Now, one of the reasons I agree with government cancelling the order from 12 to 6 is because it became unclear what the point of this vessel was for the Royal Australian Navy. And this goes back to my point of what is the overall strategy and what are the operations we need to deliver. So it is 1,600 tonnes, so almost 3 times the size of a patrol boat, depending on the patrol boat. It has a crew of 40. Your average crew has a patrol boat, your average patrol boat has a crew of 20. So it's pretty big, but it only has a 25mm gun and it can't defend itself. So it's kind of too big for constabulary operations unless you're doing long haul moving of irregular migrants, which I would say is not a function of the Navy. It is of our Navy. So it's kind of too big for constabulary operations because you want small, fast vessels. This has a maximum speed of 20 knots. And you don't want to have big crews, especially when you're having workforce problems, which Navy does. But it's too undefendable to really supplement any of the warfighting roles, right? It doesn't have missiles, it doesn't have a combat system, it has a 25mm gun. So it really got to the point of it's not clear where this fits into the order of battle and what the role of it is. That is, I think, the reason the government decided to reduce it from 12 to 6. There are a number of other project problems with it. It is listed as a project of concern, mainly because the gun that it was meant to get, it isn't feasible. And the first one, Arafura, pictured here, was actually launched in 2021. Now it's 2024 and she has not been commissioned into the Navy. She was meant to be commissioned in 2023. Now nobody has publicly stated why Arafura has not been commissioned, but that is an exceptionally long period of time between ship's launch and a commissioning, especially for a ship this simple, right? The rumour is that, the rumour from industry is that Navy insisted on too many changes. The rumour from Defence is that the vessel's unsafe. It's not clear what the answer is. Apparently she's meant to commission this year, but there are problems. Right, so getting on to the criticisms and the challenges with the Surface Combatant Fleet Review. Look, I've talked about a lot of them. One of the ones I haven't really talked about is this idea that surface combatants are obsolete. You can see here, that is a Russian landing craft in the Black Sea being targeted by an uncrewed surface vessel from Ukraine. That landing craft was actually significantly damaged. So when the Surface Combatant Fleet Review announcement came out, there were some commentators. Professor Hugh White was probably a key one. Sam Roggeveen from Lowy was another one that said surface combatants are obsolete because of uncrewed surface vessels. I don't actually believe that's true. Littoral operations, so littoral being the region where the land influences the sea and the sea influences the land, have always been dangerous for ships, right? The range of that has increased with the acquisition of UAVs and missiles, right? So it's gone beyond the range of cannon shot, but it is always dangerous. When you actually look at what has happened in the Black Sea, I've got a paper out on it with the Australian Naval Institute. You can look at all of the engagements up to about April this year. Most of the ships that were sunk had upper deck lighting on, weren't defending themselves, were at anchor, didn't have the appropriate systems on board, weren't paying attention, etc., etc. So yes, they are an issue for ships to contend with, but most of the ships that actually defended themselves were not sunk by these capabilities, right? So really, I don't think you can make the argument that uncrewed surface vessels have made ships obsolete. And in fact, what we see in the Red Sea is that despite the Houthis trying to target warships with uncrewed surface vessels, with ballistic missiles, with cruise missiles, with uncrewed aerial vehicles, of which they have been successful in targeting commercial ships, they have never hit a warship, right? So I think what we've actually seen is that warships are more defensible when they have the right systems, the right training, they're in the right posture. So I don't think it's true to say that warships are obsolete. Another criticism was that the Hunter wasn't completely cancelled. Look, you know, I think that we have sunk so much money into it, it would be a race to completely cancel it. But I do actually think that the RAN does need a dedicated anti-submarine warfare frigate, and the Hunter class will be a good frigate. It shouldn't have cost as much as it is, it shouldn't have taken as long as it has, but it will be a good capability. Some other critics have said that the Arafura should have been retained in its full size in terms of 12 strength. I think that's hard to argue. I don't see a strong argument for what the role of the Arafura is in the Royal Australian Navy. Now, if we were to establish a Coast Guard, so if my paper comes out in October and the government says, yes, this is going to be our policy, they won't. But if they did, then the Arafura might be a good vessel for a Coast Guard, but it is certainly not fitting within the capabilities that the Royal Australian Navy needs right now. Another criticism was that when it comes to general purpose frigates, we're going to build the first 3 overseas. We said we shouldn't be building ships overseas, we should be building them in Australia. Well, we have a time frame problem. We have a significant time frame problem. Even with the first ship hopefully coming in 2029, that is still a significant gap in the fleet's capabilities. So realistically, I think we should just be getting as many as we can, as quick as we can, and then work on the continued shipbuilding in Australia. Some of the challenges, look, I've spoken about workforce. As much as I said, you know, historically the Navy is almost as big as it has ever been, with the exception of World War II, it does have workforce challenges. That is true. Part of the reason for that is that the expansion of the Strategic Centre within the Department of Defence after First Principles Review in 2015, the expansion of Space Command, the expansion of Cyber Command, of which the Navy has to crew all of those things. So that is a problem. That said, you know, I do think that there really does need to be a structural review. We need to go back to a Navy being about supporting the fleet and work out how we deal with those other capabilities. Not that they're not important, they are incredibly important capabilities. But you could fill them with public service, you could have interesting arrangements, which some other countries do for their cyber commands, for example, with industry, where you have industry people identified as reservists, you have agreements with those companies that they will come and perform certain functions. There are other ways to skin that cat rather than taking up naval personnel to do that. There is a challenge mentioned in the introduction by Kim in terms of the sequencing of the building of the army ships in WA, the building of the Hunter-class frigates, the building of the general-purpose frigates, and then the building of the AUKUS SSN. That is going to be a significant challenge for us. But I think some people say challenge, oh, we shouldn't do that. Well, Australia has met many challenges in its history. In fact, when we talk about shipbuilding, I'm going to get the year wrong, I'm not a naval historian, but just at the beginning of World War II, we built 60 Bathurst-class corvettes. We exported some, in fact, to the UK and to India. Now, we'd say, oh, look, that's not complex compared to current warships. Yes, but we also didn't have the technology that we do now to build them. So we can build ships, we just have forgotten about it, I think. So, yes, this is going to be a challenge, and I don't mean to diminish it, but I think we can do it. And then the final challenge, which I've kind of reiterated a few times during this talk, is that the surface combatant fleet review only looks at surface combatants. So we still only have 2 auxiliary ships to refuel them. We still have issues with mine warfare capability, amphibious capability, hydrographic capability, etc. And one of the examples of the amphibious capability, I would say, is that we decided to expand the Army amphibious capability. Great, okay, we do have islands to our north, they're going to need that. But there is a question about, well, what is the role of the Navy's LHDs if Army's going to be operating 26 of their own amphibious craft? And I think this is a real question. Our LHDs are great for humanitarian disaster relief. They are unable to defend themselves in a contested environment and would be a liability. There's some interesting things there about they were originally based on the Juan Carlos design, which is actually like a fleet escort carrier. Now, apparently, since the 80s, we're not allowed to talk about carriers in the Royal Australian Navy. It's been banned. But I think there is a conversation about what role do they play in the fleet. Could they be a UAV carrier? Because certainly F-35s are not going to be able to reach across the Indian Ocean to protect our fleet. Anyway, I'm nearly done. I think I've got it's 1400. So I'm at the end of it. What I would say to sum up is, I've probably been a little bit flippant. It isn't all doom and gloom. There are lots of good things, right? The fact that the government has made a decision to expand the surface combatant fleet and resource it is a good thing. And that is actually a first, right? So the FSP, when it came out, the Defence Strategic Update in 2020, there was no new money for that. So these are good things. We have recognised that the Navy is central to Australia's defence and we need to expand it. But I do think that we have a lot of challenges in terms of our structure, in terms of the gaps in the capability, and the lack of an overarching strategy that says, hey, what are the maritime functions in Australia we need to do and how do we execute them, means that unless we kind of get our heads around that, I think we're going to continue making these mistakes. Right, I will leave it there because I'm at 14:01, I realise, but hopefully that was useful and I look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will have questions. To introduce and welcome back to RUSI New South Wales, our second speaker is Associate Professor Adam Lockyer. Now, Adam is an Associate Professor in Strategic Studies at Macquarie University with the Department of Security Studies and Criminology. Prior to that, he was a Research Fellow in Defence Studies at the University of New South Wales and has also held positions at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and at the Centre for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. Adam has published widely on issues relating to Australian defence strategy, US defence and foreign policy, post-conflict reconstruction, governance and insurgency. Fulbright Scholar, he held the 2015 Fulbright Scholarship in US-Australian Alliance Studies at Georgetown University and has been awarded a number of prestigious prizes for his writings. He's also spent and served for 4 years in the Australian Army. Adam spoke to us earlier in the year on the Defence Strategic Review, and we are delighted to welcome him back again today to share his views on the strategy, geopolitics and future of the Royal Australian Navy. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for the invitation back. Jen's always a hard act to follow, but I will try my best. So when Ron Lyons invited me back to speak to you today, I said yes before even knowing what I was going to say. And so when I was thinking about what I could possibly add to this conversation, I thought back to when I first heard about the Fleet Combatant Review in the Defence Strategic Review. So I thought I might almost pick up where I left off in my last talk to you back earlier this year and speak a little bit more about the strategy behind the Fleet Review and some of the conceptual thinking that went into it. So one of the odd things about the Defence Strategic Review, something that jumped out at me on the very first reading of the Defence Strategic Review, was this idea that we should have a review of the surface fleet. Because when we read other recommendations in the DSR, they're very certain about other capabilities. So when you read about the B-21 bomber, for example, they're very certain that we don't need it. There is no ifs or maybes about whether or not the B-21 would be a good capability for Australia to have. There is none. There's no qualification saying at this point in time, perhaps this is not the best capability for Australia. They are very certain in their assessment that we do not need the B-21. So in the paragraph on the B-21, they say that they've discussed the option of the B-21 with parties in Australia and the United States, and the review has said that it is not a suitable option for consideration or acquisition. Then we think about the little manoeuvre vehicle, and once again they're absolutely certain that we need it. So this is an essential and immediate capability for Australia, and there is no umming or ahhing, there is no qualifying their statement. This is something that we must have, and we must have it now. If we talk about what they call the conventionally armed, the nuclear powered submarine, they're very careful to get the terminology right. Once again, they're 100% certain that this is a great capability and that we should acquire the SSN. So fully supportive of AUKUS and the Australian Navy acquiring SSNs. Once again, no qualification, there's challenges, there's uncertainty, but we should do this. They are absolutely certain. So it kind of hits you in the face when you come to the part when they're talking about the future of the combatant surface capabilities in the DSR, when they say, we don't know. All right, we recommend that there should be a future report, a future review to look at the future capabilities of the Australian Navy. So it's a matter of sort of balancing the certainty and the absolutism of some of these other conclusions with the shrug, we don't really know, let's recommend that we should have a future review of the surface fleet and they will come with the answers. So they don't even speculate on the future contours of the future fleet. They don't say we should have, say, 20 combatants, like roughly, but a future review should go into the actual weighting of these 20. They're very certain that everything is going to be worked out in this future review. So there's this contrast between the certainty on the one hand of all these other capabilities and the shrug, we don't know, future review on the other. So there's this lack of confidence is a bit of a puzzle. Right? Well, it struck me as a bit of a puzzle of why it was that they could be so certain on the one hand about all these other issues, but then have no real, or don't even point us in the right one direction of where the answers could lie when it comes to the future combat fleet. So this is a puzzle, and as a political scientist, we love puzzles. So if somebody makes perhaps the decision to come to a PhD at some point and you decide to do it in political science, one of the very first conversations you will have with your future supervisor is, what's your puzzle, right? What's the strange thing that you want to answer? And so students will come on their first meeting and we'll bounce around ideas, and it might be something along the lines of the lethality of weapons have been steadily increasing across the second half of the 20th century, but yet casualties overall have been decreasing. This is strange, doesn't make sense. It might be that the US military spends $700 billion a year on its military, but then is a major user of private military contractors. This doesn't make sense. So on your very first day, you'll be asked to find your puzzle, right? What's strange or interesting that you want to try and grapple with? And this might be a puzzle, right? In the DSR, they're very certain on a whole list of conclusions, but when it comes time for the future fleet, the future combatant fleet, they shrug and say that's for somebody else to work out. Why? Why is it that we have this disconnect between these different capabilities? Now, as in political science, we then move to the next part of the puzzle, and so in your second meeting with your supervisor, we then start to bounce around some hypotheses of what could explain explain this puzzle. Now, when it comes for the lethality of weapons increasing over time and then casualties decreasing, it might simply be that medical evacuation and support has increased over time as well, and so therefore less people are dying. It might be that first-class nations are not fighting each other precisely because the lethality of weapons is increasing, and so therefore there's an endogeneity effect where these two things are actually connected, and there's deterrence, and so casualties are decreasing in war. So we can start to bounce around ideas about what possibly might have happened here. And so when I started to sort of bounce around some ideas about why in the DSR they were so certain on all these capabilities, but they were unsure about the future combatant fleet, there's a few things we could speculate about. Okay, there's a few reasons why they may have made this decision. Now, the first one might be that at the same time that the DSR was being written, there was another review going on, headed up by Admiral Mead, on the optimal pathway to fulfil AUKUS. These two were going on in parallel. The optimal pathway was dropped, I think, a month before the DSR was released. And so perhaps it might have just been that until we knew what this other report was going to recommend, maybe we weren't confident enough to make our own recommendations, and so we'll advise that a future report should be done. Maybe. That's plausible, except that these two, the teams were talking to each other. We saw sort of Admiral Mead and the head of the team in charge of the DSR. They were at the same conferences, they were travelling the same circles, and they probably would have asked at some point, so how's your work? All right, and got a bit of if they're not going into the details, a bit of a rough contour of what was going to be the direction they were headed in, and so you could have had some detail in here, at least sort of talking about the rough size of the future fleet. It might just be stylistic, right? A second hypothesis might be that the way that the DSR was written was very much in the style of a white paper. Right, and if you read past white papers, there is no qualifications or uncertainty in defence white papers. They are just a list of conclusions, and so because they were mirroring that, perhaps it was just a stylistic thing, right? Language they used, that they weren't going to qualify some of their other recommendations, and so when it came time for the future fleet, they were still a little unsure about what was going to happen with the SSNs, and so it was this stark contrast. Maybe, once again, that's a plausible hypothesis, except that this wasn't a defence white paper. The way that it was written was a decision, and probably the closest comparison to the DSR was the 86 DIB report. And the DIB report wasn't written in the language of a white paper. It was written like an essay, right, where for all the nuance and qualifications and the working out that went into the conclusions. So you could follow the logic all the way through until they came, or DIB came to his recommendations. So the idea that it was stylistic, maybe that put some limitations on it, but even the stylistic stuff was a decision that they made. So if we're still sort of spitballing ideas about why it was they weren't confident enough to even put in a rough general sketch of what the future fleet was going to look like, I think maybe the thing they hit up against was our maritime trade routes. And this, if when you start to dig into the DSR and the thinking that went into the DSR, this might have caused some problems for the team when they got up to the point of discussing the future fleet. Why? Well, there's a number of different schools of thought in Australian defence. But one school of thought in defence is what we might call broadly the Defence of Australia school. And so we reach back to the DIB report. Here we have an excerpt where DIB is discussing Australia's sea lanes of communication and our maritime trade. And what he argues is that Australia doesn't really need to protect our sea lanes of communication in war. So what he argues is that Australia is a continent, and a successful maritime blockade of continents have never been successful, and so we can successfully get our wartime supply across the seas by two things. First, using evasive rerouting to get around any blockade, but also improving Australia's ability to manufacture and produce our critical supplies within Australia. So these two things mean that if war ever breaks out, that Australia will not need to put a lot of effort into their sea lanes communication protection. So there's a second school of thought which is similar, and so if you're looking at Hugh White's book from 2019, How to Defend Australia, he argues that once again the Australian Navy doesn't need to defend our maritime supply in times of war, not because we don't necessarily need to, but it's a fool's errand because our sea lanes of communication are so long that we would never be able to, he argues, do end-to-end protection anyway. They're always going to be vulnerable. And so rather than trying to protect our sea lanes of communication in times of conflict, it would be better to threaten an adversary's sea lanes of communication and then get into a Mexican standoff with each other rather than trying to do protection. So there's this school of thought that argues that maritime trade is important, but it isn't a core role for Australian Defence Force and in our defence strategy. So when it comes time for the defence planning, so here we have the 87 Defence White Paper, this type of thinking then leads itself to a certain defence posture. In particular, this defence of Australia concept, that we can think of ourselves more as Fortress Australia, that we can deny our northern approaches to an opponent, and this should be the core mission of the Australian Defence Force. So here, Dib spoke about the SE gap to Australia's north, and that the Navy and Air Force should be able to shoot down or sink any adversary as they're crossing the sea, and we will be able to deter attack if we're able to convince our neighbours that we possess this capability. So there's a bit of a difference here between DIB and White. DIB was what I would probably classify more as the anti-access school of thought, which is we need to be able to convince the opponent that you will not be able to cross the SC Gap to Australia's north, you will be able to defend the archipelago to Australia's north, you will not be able to get through, and if you convince them of that, they won't try in the first place. So imagine sort of a great wall at sea across Australia's north. But there's no need to go further afield because evasive rerouting and manufacturing stuff at home will make sure that we can hold out for as long as we need. Hugh White is slightly different. He argues that across the north of Australia, rather than trying to stop them cold, so through anti-access, you can't get in, so don't even try, we need to make it risky for opponents to operate through the north of Australia's northern maritime approaches. So this is more like guerrilla warfare at sea, that if you're able to convince opponents that they can't achieve sea control through the north of Australia as they approach Australia, then they wouldn't be willing to risk high value units like aircraft carriers, troop transports, amphibious assault ships and the like, because there's all these submarines out there, unmanned surface vehicles out there that are able to deny them sea control. It's too risky, they won't try, and that's how we can deter them. So there's some of this in the DSR. In fact, there's quite a bit of this in the DSR, where they talk about a strategy of denial. So the main strategy that Australia was going to adopt, according to the DSR and later report, is that we were going to try to deny the opponents access through Australia's northern approaches. Okay, we're going to, it's going to be based upon a strategy of denial, but the end product of this was going to be deterrence. Now, a lot of commentary then came out that we're moving from being hardcore defence to being more oriented towards deterrence. But if we go back, this isn't a huge change if we have a look at past strategy as well. So if we go back to the 2016 Defence White Paper, it argues that the first strategic defence objective is to deter, deny and defeat any attempt by a hostile country or non-state actor to attack or threaten or coerce Australia. So in 2016, the principal objective of the ADF was to deny and deter attack on Australia by a similar sort of a strategy. If you go back to the 2013 Defence White Paper, once again you see that the core mission of the ADF is first to deter and then to deny an adversary access through Australia's northern approaches. You go back to 2009, this is slightly more, the language here is slightly more white than it is DIB, but still the objective here, the strategic objective here, in terms of military strategy, it means the ability to conduct independent military operations in the defence of Australia by way of controlling the air and sea approaches to Australia and denying an adversary the ability to operate without disruption in our immediate neighbourhood to the extent required to ensure the security of our territory and our people. Back to 2000, and the key to defending Australia is to control the air and sea approaches to the continent, as to deny them to hostile ships and aircraft and provide a maximum freedom of action for our own forces. This means we need a fundamentally maritime strategy. You can see a theme going back here to 1994, and once again, deter and deny the approaches to Australia is there to be seen. So the point here is that there is this one school of thought that has a long tradition through the Defence White Papers, that it is a core mission of the ADF to deny the maritime approaches to Australia and thereby deter would-be attackers on Australia. Now, where my talk last time here sort of ended was discussing the DSR and saying that, well, part of the DSR, which was talking about strategy, was really linked in with a wider coalition strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So if you have a look at what we're looking to do through the archipelago to Australia's north, it's not dissimilar to the type of strategy that the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Filipinos, and the Americans are pushing through their integrated deterrence posture. That there's going to be sort of a chain of deny and deterrence through the Indo-Pacific, which the United States will then be able to support if there is ever an attempt at one of these points within the chain. So within this chain that's spreading up through Asia, we've got the lowest link, the southernmost link within that chain. So part of this, the DSR was saying that we need to change our force structure from being a balanced force to being a focused force. So when they're talking about a balanced force, they're saying we need to be able to do a range of different missions across different contingencies. So the Navy, Army, Air Force need to have a broader suite of capabilities that we can then bundle together in a task force and then to respond to a contingency. That was good for yesteryear, but now we have a single threat. With the rise of China, we know that they are by far the greatest threat currently to stability in the Indo-Pacific and to Australia's security. And so therefore, rather than doing this full suite of different capabilities, we need to focus more clearly on responding to contingencies that would be driven by potential great power confrontation in the Indo-Pacific. So in line with that, we need to focus fleet, we need to focus force, and we need to undertake these net assessments of capabilities. So the net assessment is a change in defence planning where through the net assessment process that defence will be given a more limited number of scenarios to respond to. You then have a look at the capabilities on both sides of the equation, look at how they're going to be applied, then look at strategy and force development that flow from that. Now, there's a trade-off here, right? So if you have a focused fleet or a focused force, you generally have a force that is going to be better at responding to a more narrow suite of contingencies. And so therefore, your deterrence of those contingencies will be enhanced. However, there's all these other contingencies out on the left and right of arc that may have lesser deterrence because your capabilities are more focused at this point. So you're enhancing deterrence in one area, but in other areas we're having diminished deterrence. Okay, so that's one school. Now on the other school we have what we might call maybe the maritime mindset. And so here this one argues that what Dibb and White and others that argue for Defence of Australia gets wrong is that you can have a fortress, but if it hasn't got any water, hasn't got any food, you're not going to last very long anyway. That our maritime trade and our maritime supply in times of war are critical to Australia's defence. So James Goldrick, who's well known to many of you in the room, was a long-time sparring partner of Hugh White, and they sparred on this particular issue in particular. So it's this school of thought argues that rather than these maritime trade routes being peripheral to what the ADF needs to do, it is arguably the central objective of ADF and in particular Navy, because if you're an opponent, this is where you would likely strike at Australia. If you wanted to apply pressure on Australia, a distant blockade of Australian maritime trade and supply during times of war would be easier than attacking Australia itself. And so if that is the low-hanging fruit, as far as your opponent's concerned, then it makes sense that this is the thing that you'll be structuring your force to undertake. So, and there's a lot to be said for this maritime mindset. Jen mentioned a lot of this, so I won't spend too much time on it, but Australia is incredibly vulnerable to disruptions in our overseas trade. So the World Bank report in 2020 said that only 5.6% of Australia's GDP is represented by domestic manufacture. The rest is brought in from overseas. So that ranks Australia 147th amongst the 219th nations that were in the report. Australia's self-sufficiency in terms of manufacture is the lowest in the OECD. And not only are we completely dependent on overseas manufacturers coming into Australia, we are completely dependent on manufacturers from one particular country that you can probably guess. So in 1990, only 5% of Australia's 5% of Australia's exports went to China. But by 2020, China represented 42% of Australia's exports, particularly in iron ore and natural gas. So these trade routes in peacetime are critical to Australia. We're already seeing that what happens to the cost of living when maritime trade is affected overseas, sometimes very far from Australia. And if disruption of our exports to China was ever affected, this would have a real impact on our standard of living in Australia. So it's arguable that it's critical to Australia's defence security during times of peace to maintain these maritime trade routes. But in times of war, it is also going to be critical. So there's a whole bunch of small things that we probably don't even think about that we're completely dependent on in order to continue living. So things like water purification of our dams. That's imported. The chemicals we use to purify our water, they come from China and Canada. Which would be disrupted in times of conflict. And so where are we going to get fresh water from? Fuel is something that is also often pointed to. Australia's strategic reserve in fuel is kept in the United States, but we have no real plan for getting it here in times of conflict. In terms of semiconductors, 60% of the world's semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. We don't have an indigenous or domestic supply route for that. So we can talk about putting together ships and putting together missiles, but all the components are still within a global supply chain that would be disrupted in times of conflict. And so what we see here is that there are many points that the Australian, not just our economy, but our lifestyle would need to change in terms of conflict if we can't defend or secure our overseas supply routes. So our overseas supply routes would change from peacetime to wartime. So during peacetime, most of our trade routes are to the north, so pass up through the archipelago to Australia's north and end up in China, Japan, South Korea. During times of conflict, we'll change from trade routes to supply routes, and these would tend to be horizontal, so heading off to Europe or to the United States. So these would change in orientation, but still, we'd still need to supply our allies in the north with natural gas, particularly the Japanese and South Korean economies are dependent upon Australia's gas exports, and so we'd still need to have some sort of plan for getting some of our natural resources up to our allies in times of war. So this then brings us to, well, how will all that play out? One of the problems is with our merchant fleet. So over the past few decades, the Australian Shipping Register has nearly vanished. There's only a dozen or so Australian flagged ships currently available, and they're not large ships generally. And so we're not going to be able to export LPG gas, fuel, heavy lift or container ships. And at the moment that Switzerland has a larger merchant fleet than Australia. So even if in times of conflict we have a combatant fleet to be able to do end-to-end protection, we haven't got a merchant fleet that will be able to move our critical supplies into Australia and export to our allies. So this is a table that I like. It was produced by the Australian Naval Institute and the Naval Studies Group at the University of New South Wales. I think Jen's a member of that. And so this is based upon a Goldrick seminar that they keep updating. And it just summarises both maritime trade, so this is trade that will be disrupted, probably changed during times of war, but what the impact of that would be on Australia's ability to win and fight a conflict. So if maritime trade is heavily degraded, then we're probably going to not be able to undertake offensive operations. We probably can't win. We may be defeated, but this is not as bad as if our sea supply during times of conflict is degraded, in which case, according to this assessment, we would be forced to surrender. So this is not within this maritime mindset, protecting our trade routes and our overseas supply in times of war is not a peripheral task. This is, in a game of chess, knocking over your king. It's time to surrender. So what does the DSR say about both these schools of thought? So what it argues here is that while there is presently only a remote possibility of a power contemplating invasion of Australia, that the threat to our overseas supply is a more likely scenario. So within the DSR, there's also a forceful endorsement of this maritime mindset. So they're having it a little bit both ways here. They've got heavily leaning upon that DIB idea of deny and deter through Australia's north, but also sort of more of the Goldrick type of thinking about maritime trade and supply as being central and important. So what if you were to have a maritime mindset and think about what the posture of the ADF, and in particular the Navy, ought to be, then it's going to lead you to a very different conclusion about what the ADF would look like than if you had a more continentalist approach or Defence of Australia approach. So in particular, what you'd be emphasising is that regardless of how big the Australian fleet is, even if the Australian fleet was as large as the United States Navy, it couldn't be everywhere all the time. And so it's going to be a matter of burden sharing between like-minded powers, friendly nations. There'll be a community of nations which are all going to share the good order at sea and protection of maritime shipping during peacetime. So there'll be a willingness of the ADF and the ability of the ADF to contribute to things like the Red Sea operations and be able to support those type of operations with a vessel. That would also be critical to this would be a willingness and ability of a great power, probably the United States, to uphold the international order. In wartime, we need a fleet that is going to be able to do end-to-end protection for our critical supply, to defend ports and approaches against mining and blockade, and to defeat enemy forces deployed against the Australian mainland. So the type of thinking about the world is going to be quite different in a maritime mindset, right? You're going to be thinking about cooperation, collaboration with other nations of the world, and that we're all in this together. Whether that's Houthi rebels or Russian aggression in Ukraine, we're all in this together, and you're going to want to go out and nip threats to the order in the bud before they get out of hand. So the lack of confidence, I'll come back to the puzzle to sum up, is, well, the DSR had these two ideas in their head which had more or less equal weighting. On the one hand, they wanted to construct a defence policy, a defence strategy that was based upon more of a defence of Australia type of mindset. There's an archipelago to Australia's north that we're going to defend and to deter any opponent coming towards Australia, lowest end of the chain going up through Indo-Pacific. But on the other hand, they also had this idea of this maritime mindset. And so when you have a look at what we need to do, the Australian Navy must be optimised for operating in Australia's immediate region and for securing our sea lanes and communication and maritime trade. They want to do both, right? Having it both ways here. And so when they sat down, and I imagine, I don't know this, but I imagine when they sat down and they were thinking about the future of the surface fleet, they had these different ideas in their head simultaneously. So the first one, we want to design a surface fleet that is optimised for operating in Australia's immediate region as part of a denial strategy through Australia's northern archipelagos and choke points. Okay, keep that in mind. At the same time, we also want to secure Australia's international trade in peacetime and international supply in wartime. So you've got to keep that in mind as well. And finally, you want to follow the principles of focus force. Okay? So you want to do those three things all in one go. And these things will be coming into collision, right? So how do you do all those three things and play fair? And that cognitive dissonance would have been difficult to work around. And so what I think one hypothesis might be that, well, you have these three different things, and how do you make an assessment on the future fleet while not going back and undercutting or undermining some of the principles that have been scattered through the report up to this point. And that would have been very difficult. And so the way they could have worked around this is to say this is somebody else's problem. And so the designers of the Surface Fleet Review, I feel like they got around this by just loosening those restrictions at all, because those three restrictions were within the frame of the Defence Strategic Review. But when the review of the service fleet sat down, they approached it with a more pragmatic view. We have these different objectives to do, and I think that if I was to look at this, the thing that has fallen away the most is this idea of a focused fleet, right? So if you had a focused fleet that was optimised to deny and deter through Australia's north, you could have gone a more DIB way, in which case you would have had more of a battle fleet and less frigates, everything else, because you want to send a strong signal that any opponent will not get through. There's a great wall at sea, and you can defend the maritime approaches to Australia's north. If you had gone more of a white approach to a focused fleet through Australia's north, it would have been more about mine laying, about fast missile boats, lots of smaller submarines type of thing, where what you're trying to do is convince the opponent that their high value units, the aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, they could possibly get in through Australia's maritime north, but they would be at risk. And so the risk wouldn't be worth the political payoff of operating through there, deploying them through there. But once again, you could play fair, right? Focused fleet, denying the northern approaches to the opponent. Or you could have had a focused fleet that was optimised with a maritime mindset of protecting the maritime supply and trade. In which case you would have had sort of the frigates that would be able to patrol and contribute to overseas operations, like in the Red Sea. So what they've done is they've kind of had a bit of everything's in there. So it's more of a balanced review rather than being a focused fleet, which is probably what should have been done. And there is still sort of work to be done on periphery in terms of the auxiliaries. I agree completely with Jen on that front. But you see that this is probably what has happened here in terms of not being able to square the circle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do now is I'll hand over to Captain Chris Skinner, who's our moderator for this afternoon's panel discussion. Chris, known to many, he's a board member of RUSI New South Wales and is a chair of our Defence Industry and Innovation Committee. Chris served for some 30 years as a weapons and electrical engineering officer in the Royal Australian Navy, serving on 6 surface ships, including all 3 DDG guided missile destroyers, HMAS Hobart, Perth and Brisbane. His last post, I think, was he was the initial Anzac frigate project manager as well. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Kim. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll crack on at a fast rate to get through as many questions as possible, and if we run out of the written ones, then we'll open up to the floor. Okay. First question from Noel Michael from the Defence Security Circle, London. Is the composition and size of the surface fleet desired influenced by consideration of alliance commitments such as ANZUS or geopolitical arrangements such as the Quad or other Australian bilateral arrangements such as Japan?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks so much. I think that's a fantastic question. Look, I don't think the outcomes in February were influenced by alliance commitments, except to say that when you think about the potential of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and Adam spoke a little bit about roles, I think it's becoming very clear that there's an expectation from the United States that Australia's role is to protect Australia. From the bomber force rotations that are occurring frequently now through the Northern Territory to Submarine Rotation Force West, which clearly shows that the US intends on using HMAS Sterling as a key submarine base in the way it did during World War II, it is very clear that the US have, I think, communicated to Australia that role. Now, protecting Australia, as Adam talked through, I'm obviously from the Maritime School of Thought. James Goldrick was my commandant at the academy. But protecting Australia does mean ensuring seaborne supply to Australia to support not only Australian operations but US operations from Australia. So I think the expansions would have had a view to those roles and responsibilities in the Indo-Pacific and the alliance commitments there. More broadly, in terms of the decision about the general purpose frigate, which is the 11 frigates we're going to acquire, 8 of which we will build, I think that will have a view to not so much alliance commitments, but partnerships. And so of the 4 countries that are currently on the table to build that frigate, so Germany, Spain, Japan, and South Korea, we're expecting a down select in the next couple of months. I'm surprised it hasn't happened already, but next couple of months. There is a strong view, and I would probably agree with this, that a factor in that down select will actually be the relationships with Japan and South Korea. And certainly at the last Indian Ocean Defence Symposium, the Australian Chief of Navy, Admiral Mark Hammond, was talking a lot about the Japanese frigate. Now, he's actually not the decision maker for the down select. So I think that those partnerships will also have an influence on that and trying to integrate those defence industries. In terms of the Quad, no. Look, I think the Quad is a longer conversation. I think Adam would probably have quite a few views on this. It's interesting what the Quad is. I kind of put the Quad down to more of a messaging, and that messaging is powerful in terms of the engagement of India and Japan in the Quad. But in terms of a military arm and something that would influence defence acquisition, I don't see it in that way. Yes, there is an increased relationship from a military sense with India. Certainly the Australian ambassador to India talks about interoperability and interchangeability. I think those two things are currently unlikely. So I'd say that the decision to expand the fleet was influenced by the need to protect Australia and the expectations of the US, and the decision for the general purpose frigate, I would say, will be influenced by partnerships in Asia.
Okay, Adam, I'm sure you have something to add.
Yeah, I agree completely with Jen. And all I would add was that although I don't think the alliance partnerships were at the forefront of the designers' minds when they were thinking about the number of ships or the type of ships that we're going to need, the backdrop to all of this is the United States. And the fact that the DSR opening line, may not be the opening line, but it's very close to the front of the report, was that Australia's geopolitical circumstances have changed because the United States no longer enjoys primacy through the Indo-Pacific. And if the United States no longer enjoys primacy through the Indo-Pacific, what that means is that, well, who is going to uphold the international rules-based order, who is going to ensure good order at sea, if the maritime space is going to be contested, what does that mean for Australian maritime trade and supply? And so that's the backdrop to all of this. And so rather than necessarily being able to go through line by line and saying that this was a result of alliance partnerships, the broader context of these decisions are certainly based upon the balance of power between China and the United States, and the fact that we're now entering a new era where the maritime space is going to be contested.
Which brings us naturally to the next question from Paul Sinados. What should be the focus of an Australian maritime strategy? Would there be commonalities with other Pacific powers, such as Japan, USA, or even Fiji?
I think that's a great question. I'm super excited to hear people asking me about an Australian maritime strategy. I can't promote enough the fact that I think we need one. Now, I know that there might be some people in defence here will say, oh, maybe it exists. You left the Navy last year. Maybe it actually exists behind some classified paywall. And I'm like, well, if it does, you wrote that very fast. Look, but to take it seriously, look, in terms of the aim, I think the first aim of an Australian maritime strategy would be understanding the broad range of our roles and responsibilities, whether that be national roles and responsibilities or the expectations of the region. And that could be the expectation of the Pacific Island countries, which clearly have a security expectation of Australia, and we do a number of deployments supporting dealing with IUU fishing, the expectation of our Southeast Asian nations, who, when they think of Australia, when we call ourselves a small navy, they kind of balk at it. They think of us as a regional maritime power. Yes, their navies are technically bigger, but they don't have the same amount of firepower. So I think the first step is understanding what are our roles and responsibilities, national expectations within the region. And then the second step in Australian maritime strategy is understanding what structure we need. I can't say structure enough to resource it. As much as I'm excited about the Australian Navy fleet expanding, I feel like we skipped a few steps in terms of understanding what we need to do. So those would be the first two things I would talk about as the focus of that maritime strategy. And I think that too, when you think about those things as the focus, then you become a little bit more liberal in terms of how do you achieve this. So, I mentioned in my talk about, when we talk about structure, we really need to talk about Coast Guard and maritime border protection for Australia. And if you think about that and you think about the roles in supporting our Pacific Island countries, then maybe that does actually open up opportunities for forward basing of Coast Guard ships, crewing of Coast Guard ships with Pacific Island friends, joint crewing with New Zealand. When we talk about a Royal Fleet Auxiliary, then maybe if we're thinking about that structure, it actually opens up opportunities for crewing with Southeast Asian nations, specifically thinking of the Philippines, for example, there. So I think if you start with those 2 points, then you can actually open your aperture in terms of how you think about addressing some of these challenges. I think because we haven't started with those 2 points and the whole idea of what is our strategy, we have a very closed aperture about how we think we're dealing with these, which I think, from a workforce perspective, from a capability perspective, is going to keep coming up against a significant number of challenges.
That's a great question, thank you. So I agree broadly with Jen again. So I think that when we're talking about the roles of Navy, we need to understand more about the actors that we're engaging with and the type of contingencies that we're looking to deter, and the allies and friends that we're trying to reassure. So I think that as we're trying to get more focused on the challenges posed by the rise of China, there's a trap here that we might fall into, that the primary objective of the ADF, and particularly the Navy, is to deter China from threatening Australia's strategic interests and Australia itself. But just taking a step back, there's a few steps that would lead into any contingency that would threaten Australia's strategic interests. So, for example, if we have very much a focused force that is primarily to defend the choke points to Australia's north, then what does that mean for our partnerships with South Pacific nations? And if we are not able to step up and help in humanitarian disaster relief contingencies, if we're not able to train with them, if we're not able to engage with them, then there's going to be a vacuum and somebody else will fill that void. And so all of a sudden we're in a situation where there might be potential hostile great power that has a footprint in Australia's immediate region, and all of a sudden things start to spiral from there. So when we're thinking about the type of contingencies that we need to be able to respond to, everything is going to be about China, right? So if there is an earthquake, and our response to that is going to be against this backdrop of strategic competition between the United States and China, and Australia's place within that. So there's a broad range of different things that we're looking to deter, from fishing bases in Daru Island through to Chinese policing presence in Solomon Islands. There's a whole bunch of different steps that would lead to a point where China is directly threatening our strategic interests. And one of those slides there was looking at how much trade is between China and Australia, and any major conflict between us is going to be devastating to us. Like, nobody wins a war with China, right? Even if we win, we lose, right? And so we need to be able to shape and influence events in our region away from conflict, and that requires a fleet that's able to undertake this full range of missions that we asked of it.
Can I add one more comment? I'll be quick. Only because if we sit here and agree, it'll be not spicy and not interesting. So I'm gonna controversially disagree on 2 points. One, in terms of this idea of the strategy of deterrence, I agree that this is a sound strategy for Australia. But I think that what has happened since the Defence Strategic Update and since the Defence Strategic Review is this obsession with the word deterrence in Australia. And I think that it is an element of our strategy, it is a key element of our strategy, but when we think about the structure of a Navy, and I wish I could pull up a slide with, for those that follow this geeky stuff, there's Ken Booth's triangle that talks about all the different functions of a Navy, from diplomacy to military to policing, constabulary operations. The Navy's functions are very broad, they always will be broad. And so the expansion of the fleet, the government may have agreed to fund it because of concerns about China, but actually the functions of that fleet are not just about China at all. There are a broad range of functions. And I think that we become very focused sometimes on this idea of the focused force. I actually think that was a mistake in the Defence Strategic Review. With no disrespect to them, they put a lot of thought into it, it's just a difference of opinion. And that's because I come from a force design background. Focused force is really about determining what is the scenarios of which you will war game against to determine your force structure. But when you think about the structure of a fleet, there is a lot written on this in terms of a medium power like Australia that has constraints in terms of how much they can spend and how much they can crew. You will always need to have a balanced fleet because you will always need to perform those range of functions that Ken Booth articulates. So I think that we can become very focused on some of the things from the DSR about focused force and about deterrence, and I think that those are important parts of our strategy. But I also note that, and Adam gave a great talk about maritime school of thought versus White and Dibb. There was actually with no disrespect to that team, there was no maritime professionals on that Defence Strategic Review team whatsoever, which is why I think it is a little bit confused in its thinking. And it takes this idea of a focused force, which in a naval context, and I talked about this in my ASCII piece last year, does not work for Australia. Australia will always need to have a balanced fleet because of those range of functions. Anyway, please feel free to tell me I'm wrong, by the way, I might be.
I'd like to jump in now with a question of my own, which I feel immediately follows what we've just heard. The Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport Research Economics, in their most recent report, stated there are more than 6,000 merchant ships involved in international trade with Australia, and they conduct 17,300 voyages to and from international ports with Australian ports each year. So my question to the panel is, do you agree with Hugh White that it's impossible to protect those sea lines of communication and maritime trade, as the DSR actually does spell out in paragraph 18, as you put on your slide, Adam, and which Chief of Navy has sort of reiterated as defence of Australia's national interests? So do you agree with Hugh White that it's pointless trying to protect 6,000 ships doing all those voyages, and we should therefore have a strike capability so that any antagonist would have second thoughts about interfering with our trade?
You go first.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that one of the points I was trying to make in my talk was there is a difference between trade and supply. And so when we start thinking about supply, we're looking at a much smaller number of, we're not looking at 6,000 ships, okay? That's trade, not supply. So when we're looking at, we need to go back and take a review of all the critical elements that we need to import, but also the supply that our allies are going to need from Australia. From that list, we need to then come with a plan of how we're going to do that. So the first thing we need is a strategy, a plan of how we're going to do that before we can even make an assessment of whether it's possible or not. So I would hazard a guess to say that right now, today, it's not possible, right? Because the size of the fleet and the fact that we are not even aware of exactly what we need. So as soon as the conflict begins and our trade is disrupted, all of a sudden a whole bunch of small things that we never even thought about are going to pop up and going to put clogs in our systems. All of a sudden we realise we need ball bearings for things. And so unless we have a thorough review, first of all, we have a plan, a strategy, we can then make an assessment of how we're going to have a contingency if those are disrupted, where are these things going to come from. From that, we can then start making an assessment of, well, size of fleet, structure, posture, and how we're going to deal with these issues in times of conflict. It might be about stockpiling, it might be about finding alternate supply that are going to be assured during times of disruption. But right now, we don't even know what we need, let alone how we're going to go about protecting it.
Oh, I've got my, there you go. Do I agree with Hugh White? I'd love to say yes, but my answer is no. So I guess there's a couple of elements, right? I think that when you argue things by extremes, I think it's unhelpful. I think it sits in the grey. So Hugh White, 6,000, in his recent piece he actually talks about 17,000 ships that visit Australia and having to protect them, and you couldn't possibly do that with convoy operations. And I think that's being a little bit extreme because that is not actually how you would do it. I agree, Adam is absolutely correct, and James Goldrick wrote about this a lot. It's about understanding what is the critical seaborne supply, where is that going to come from, right? So you're threat reducing down the amount of ships that need to be protected. Secondly, protection of shipping is not just about convoy operations. Convoy operations is one way to approach it over certain bodies of water, but it's also about being able to contain an adversary that might threaten shipping, right? So for example, Adam spoke about in his talk the fact that yes, most of our maritime trade at the moment is north-south, but in the event of a conflict it would become east-west, and that in fact is what happened during World War II. So actually, if you think about China, say China was a potential adversary, and that's who we're concerned about, well, China has one base outside of China, effectively, which is in Djibouti, right? And it has limited capability base there. So actually, you could think about protecting that east-west trade to Australia is actually about keeping China contained north of the Indonesian archipelago and not letting them through the Malacca Strait. Now, when you think about that as a problem set and being able to do that with a naval force, or actually should use a joint force these days or integrated or whatever buzzword we want to throw out, that becomes a much more manageable task. So yes, I do think you could protect seaborne supply to Australia. I completely agree with Adam that I don't think that we have a good understanding of what the critical seaborne supply is. It's easy to throw out the fuel statistics because that's relatively obvious. But, you know, Adam's statistic, for example, about the water purification, you know, there's others thrown out about fertiliser, etc. And again, this goes back to having an understanding of what our maritime strategy is. What are the things that we can become resilient on? For example, when it comes to refining fuel, we need more fuel refineries, then we can be importing crude oil across the Indian Ocean. We need to become more dependent when it comes to energy. So I don't agree with Hugh White, and I often think, you know, obviously he's a famed Australian strategist whom I deeply respect. Hugh White wrote the 2000 White Paper, and I think that a lot of his work since, which 2000 White Paper reduced kind of the impact of maritime and we were moving into a more land forces-centric way of thinking, is about justifying the 2000 White Paper. And I think maritime trade has moved on substantially since then.
Okay, I would like to pick up on something that you said, Jennifer, in terms of contingencies and what should we prepare for. And look somewhere besides China and a full-scale global war to imagine, if you will, the iron ore and natural gas trade travelling through the Lombok Strait up through the area between Indonesia and the Philippines, and lo and behold there are Islamic terrorist groups operating in Mindanao right now, have been for many years. And what if they decided to behave like the Houthis in Yemen and start disrupting those trade routes, not only to protect them, but think of the effect on our economy of loss of that very fast export trade and the need to reroute the ships in various directions, the insurance costs and so on. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really great scenario. Obviously, Australia has done a lot of work with the Philippines in terms of counter-terrorism, but it is not unfeasible for a scenario like is happening in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the moment to occur in our region. We're one kind of failing state away from that happening. And so this is why, you know, I've spoken a lot, I think, in the media, I've written a lot about the fact that we should have cared more about what the Houthis were doing. Because us not caring, and now we are sending a team to go and command that task force, that's great, but us not caring sends a message about what happens when non-state actors interfere, or state actors for that matter, with maritime trade. And that also sends a message to our region and people will be watching. So I think that we need to be able to think more broadly about the threats to maritime security. You know, as I mentioned before, China is a concern, but you know, if you go back through history, it's always the thing that you thought that was going to happen, which is not the thing that actually happens. And there are a lot of other concerns in our region. The one you mentioned there about some of our key choke points being closed off by non-state actors, by terrorists, that is a feasible option. Also, North Korea taking the action to interfere with maritime trade, to send a message. It might be less feasible, but we can get to that point. There are a whole heap of flashpoints. So I think that Australia does need to think more broadly about maritime security. And this is where I have this challenge about everything now is about deterring China, because there is a broad range of maritime tasks that we need to be able to do.
Thank you. The only other thing I could add to that, I think, is to talk a little bit about the proliferation of technology. So with drones in particular, and off-the-shelf drones, for lack of a better word, that can be modified by technicians. It allows that for shipping to potentially be disrupted. In this particular scenario, it's slightly different to, say, the Red Sea, because we can, at least in the short term, do some evasive rerouting to get our trade through in most circumstances. But that doesn't stop the increasing threat over time that non-state actors with very few members, with very little financing, may be able to put shipping at risk, and all those scenarios you're talking about.
Thank you. Question from Kevin Baird, member of RUSI. Given the fate of the sloops Yarra and Armidale in 1942, are we condemning future REN personnel to heroic defeats in underarmed and underperforming vessels?
Yes or no?
Look, I think it is a really tough one. If a war kicked off in the Indo-Pacific, I probably would not want to be sitting on an Anzac-class frigate in the middle of the South China Sea. That said, of course, the Anzac-class frigate does have a fantastic radar with the Australian CEA radar, but it does not have very good missiles to be able to take out things at range. So it would be a difficult situation to be put in. And I think that, sometimes we forget about these points, and I'm glad you raised it when we talk about the debate. Right? I think this comment is also really applicable to the submarine debate, where a lot of people talk about, well, we should have just, in fact, Hugh White talks about, we should have just gotten 40 conventional submarines. Now, taking away the cost of that, I do think that we need to remember that when we talk about conflict in the region, we are talking about the death of Australians. That's what was going to happen if Australia is involved in a conflict. And we do need to give those Australians the ability to defend themselves as much as possible. And so when we talk about, oh God, I can't believe we're investing another $11 billion in surface combatants, I think we need to change the narrative with the Australian public in terms of the women and men of the Royal Australian Navy and the broader Australian Defence Force do deserve the equipment that allows them to have a fighting chance. I don't subscribe to the theory that surface combatants are obsolete, and any surface combatant sitting in the first or second island chain would be destroyed quickly. I think what we've seen from the Red Sea, now the Houthis are a very different problem set to China, but they are getting good targeting from Iran. It is actually very hard to take out a warship. Prior to the Red Sea, people said, well, ballistic missiles are going to completely defeat ships. Ships have no chance. But actually, the Houthis have been employing ballistic missiles, and ships have been shooting them down. So that is a long answer to what I think you wanted as a yes or no. I won't give that yes or no, except for the fact to say that our current capability is fairly obsolete, and it is important that we try and transition and upgrade that capability as quickly as possible to give the sailors of the Royal Australian Navy the best fighting chance.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to my time limit. I would say from my own personal recollection that after the Falklands War in 1982, everybody predicted surface warships were history, so they're never going to be feasible again. And then we had the Anzac frigate for 10 ships for Australia and New Zealand, and just to prove them wrong, so I suggest it may happen again. There are a couple of questions we haven't got to about the large optionally crewed surface vessels, and you could spend a lot of time talking about what are they going to look like and how they're going to operate, and what happens when some minor piece of equipment breaks down and there's nobody on board to fix it or to, oil the bearings or whatever one does. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our very, very erudite panel.
Oh wow. Let's move to the vote of thanks. I just say on behalf of AUSI New South Wales that it has been an absolute honour to have both of you with us today to explore the outcomes of the Defence Service Combatant Fleet Review, its successes and its potential foes and maybe its potential shortcomings. Jennifer, thank you very much for your deep dive into the detail of the review, and Adam, thank you for your insights into the DSR puzzle. And for the sobering revelation that Switzerland has a large merchant fleet, which is even more extraordinary when, as both have highlighted, Australia is so utterly reliant on the flow of trade, or probably more so on the flow of supply through the sea lanes that connect us to the world. So thank you both for your thought-provoking observations. And thank you for contributing to AUSI New South Wales' efforts to promote debate and inform the public on these and other important defence and security studies issues. And you've given us much to consider. May I just then, on behalf of AUSI, offer you a small token of gratitude. Present Jennifer. On a certificate for honorary membership of AUSI New South Wales for 12 months, scarf and AUSI pin. So thank you very much. Adam's already got his certificate since that time ago, and Adam, there's a limit to the number of AUSI ties at the moment. We've probably got in your boardroom. So in lieu, may I just please present you with that small gift, and thank you very much.